Hello, it's Meg, and today I have a special spooky ghost story for you from our friend, the author, Sarah Sullivan. If you didn't catch our episode on navigating tough times, please check it out because you will get to meet Sarah Sullivan, who in her 90s released her first book of poetry, Memoirs in Poetry and Paint, and that is available for purchase on Amazon. Recently, Sarah has been going through some of her short stories and working on editing and putting some of those together, and perhaps in the future we'll be lucky enough to get a book of short stories from Sarah. But today, she has been gracious enough to let me read out loud for you a spooky ghost story. It's semi-autobiographical. The names have been changed to protect the innocent, and maybe some of the locations as well. So sit back and buckle up for a spooky story entitled Henry. Henry and I met in July of 1976. He was a tall, rugged man, looking about 58 years old, 6'6", with a large head, a craggy, kind face, and lots of gray hair. I had been restless all day, longing to get outside in the fresh air of the city. John Del Valentino Gallery at the Hilton Hotel on 57th Street was where I worked as the manager. The day had been busy. I was regretful that I no longer lived around the corner at the Buckingham Suites. The Buckingham was so convenient to the Hilton that I could have walked home. I hated thinking about the crowded bus to get downtown to my new apartment, which was on 26th Street off 3rd Avenue. Not a bad location, but certainly not the beautiful one of the past. I decided when I arrived on the street and the air was so lovely with the smell of flowers, and there was a mime drawing a crowd about halfway down the street with his exaggerated poses, that, yes, I was going to stay up here for a while. Feeling a bit lonely, I'm not ready to go home on such a nice evening, I decided to walk to the Plaza Hotel or sit on the benches not far from there in Central Park. I was carrying my black leather portfolio full of drawings and paintings. When the gallery was empty, I would do some homework. All my classes in fabric design, and I had already sold some of the sketches. I paused at the side entrance to the somewhat famous Bull and Bear at the Plaza, and looked longingly to the sound of shared camaraderie and laughter as the door opened. A young man and a woman were stepping out of the door. He held the door for me, saying, "Go for it. No one will bite you." Strange, I thought, that he should say that. I was feeling nervous and not sure that I would be welcome. I remembered all the fuss that had gone on just a few years before about women not being welcomed in a bar alone, but I was determined to conquer my fears, and I had begun doing things out of step with my old habits. Taking myself in hand, I entered with a feeling like Little Red Riding Hood approaching the big bad wolf. Oh my goodness, there's only one seat available. The place is so crowded. God, what should I do? I thought. I've never sat at a bar alone. On the rare occasions when I go to Manhattan, I would always wait and meet my husband outside. Not because of his decision, but because of mine. Bill had tried encouraging me to be more outgoing. He had finally introduced me to the bartender at Longchamp's on 42nd Street, which was across the way from the building he worked in. "Please don't stand out in the cold. You know Jack, and he'll take care of you." Why, I wondered, had I learned to be so afraid of men and so shy of people in general? Well, I was going to turn over a new leaf. I stood there gathering courage, and then I approached the bar, jockeying to sit down between two men. My briefcase was so long, and I was having difficulty settling it before my feet. First I bumped the man on my left and apologized. Then I bumped the man on my right. "What'll you have?" asked the bartender. "I'll have a whiskey sour," I said quickly. It was the only drink I knew about. "So how are you?" said the man on my left. I looked over, and he was well dressed and very good looking, and that was downright scary to me. I had not spoken to strange men except in the company of my husband, and I simply did not think I knew any small talk. "Fine, thanks," I said, shifting to look away from him. I bumped the man on my right. Oh, I was quickly regretting my first foray into society. Let me out of here, I thought. "Henry Johnson," he said, putting out a very large hand that completely enclosed mine. "What kind of painter are you? My daughter is a professional artist in Virginia." His speech was slow, southern, and very gentle, almost lazy. I confess I had never talked to a southerner before, and I was fascinated by the voice pattern. I had to strain to understand it. "Well, I'm actually studying design at the Fashion Institute here, but I do have a degree in fine art. This is some homework I was doing today. I manage the gallery at the Hilton Hotel on 68th Street. It was such a long speech for me, and it was the beginning of a very long conversation about art and galleries in New York City and families of his and mine. Henry said, "Well, I'm a country lawyer from Virginia, married with 2 grown children who are both in graduate schools. I told him I was recently divorced and had 5 sons, the youngest living with my sister on Long Island and the other 4 out on their own. I had to say I was 44 twice because he looked so skeptical and said, 'You have all those children and you look like you're about 29. Half an hour later, Henry looked at me and said, "Little lady, would you do me the honor of joining me for dinner? I'm a stranger in town. I usually eat alone, but I sure would enjoy your company. We could eat right here in the hotel, and after that, I will get a cab to send you home early and safely." Good Lord, I thought, the Plaza Hotel, and he said cab and safely? "Well, yes, I'd like that," I said, still a little shyly. "Good then, it's done," he said, calling the bartender to reserve a table. "I usually stay here when I'm in town." The meal, needless to say, was superb. I had lamb chops. "Pick it, Sarah. What would you like for dessert?" he said. "Well, I don't know. What would you recommend?" "May I suggest Cherry's Jubilee?" he said. "It's their specialty." "Wow, it sounds wonderful," I said. The waiter returned and began preparing the dessert. I, being nervous, continued talking. "Excuse me, little lady," Henry said. "We are seeing an elegant show. It is being put on just for us, and it must be fully enjoyed. This is a moment to be savored, so some silence must rage." So I had learned the lesson of being in the moment. Henry called a cab for me, and I was back home at 8:30 p.m. The phone was ringing as I opened the door. "Oh, hello, Henry," I said, surprised. "I was just checking to see that you arrived home safely. By the way, do you mind if I drop around to the gallery to see the work you have there?" "Oh, yes, I'd like that, and thank you so much for the wonderful evening and dinner," I said. "My pleasure, little lady. It is I who am grateful to you for such a beautiful and gracious companion." Well, I thought, I'm really going to like this southern gallantry. Henry arrived the next day around midday, and I showed him around the gallery, explaining the various styles, talking about the biographies of the artists. "I would like to take you out to dinner again," he said, "but I have a plane to catch and I must leave for the airport. Here is my personal phone number, and you may call me at any time. May I call on you when I return to New York next week?" For several weeks, I would receive a call from Virginia, and he would be in town and drop by the gallery as I was closing and take me out for dinner. I was also busy with a new friend who I'd met at the gallery. This one was a single pilot, 35 years, based in Los Angeles. Home away from home for the crew in New York was the Hilton Hotel. Suddenly, I realized I was on a whirlwind and busy all the time. I had been dating Ed, a man of 65 years who lived in the Lincoln Towers. He often called with tickets to the ballet, opera, or concerts at the Lincoln Center. His balcony on the 14th floor had a view of the Lincoln Center, a beautiful apartment. I enjoyed his company, but I found him too aggressive. I know he asked often, but I was not inclined to marry him, and I told him so. I said, "Let's just be friends." He was extremely possessive and demanding. He pursued me with gifts and money, which I steadfastly refused. He would often come in with an item from friends in the garment district, beautiful gowns and suits for me. He had been a manufacturer with a very big company, a bridal salon, and they still advertised on television with his company. He was now retired. About 3 months after I met Henry, he said, "How would you like to take a trip with me to Lyndon's place? I'm talking about Lyndon Johnson's ranch in Texas. Lyndon is a personal friend of mine." And that's when I discovered that my friend was much more than a country lawyer from Virginia. Henry was the financial advisor for the new candidate for the Democratic Party, Jimmy Carter. He had been the president of the Chicago Board of Trade, and he was also on the staff of Lyndon Johnson's Ways and Means Committee and a staffer to John F. Kennedy. As a young man, he'd even been a page during Franklin Roosevelt's years at the White House, and he was a trustee on the board of a major university. He was from a prominent family. I was upset. Oh my God, I thought, I'm out of my league here. "Honey," he said, "what I like most about you is that you know who you are and there's no pretense. And since I know who I am, we can be honest friends." I guess inevitably, Henry and I did become more than friends. He was living in the same house, apart from his wife, and they had been for many years. He sent me the galleys of the books he was writing. Henry and I talked about many different subjects. If Henry could be labeled about anything, it was that he was a superb raconteur, and I was later told, and have read the same in books about him, that he could hold Kennedy's and Johnson's attention for hours, and they loved it. Realizing this and finding out about the Deep South, I began telling him about some classes I had taken. Last year I had taken the mind control classes and Edgar Cayce's studies and Seth Speaks, and had gone to a therapist. I needed them because I was almost suicidal after the divorce. Well, Henry had not done any of these things, but he surprised me with his interest, and one day he said he had, as a trustee of the university, been privy to some interesting experiments which were and are being conducted in the physics lab. The experiments are out-of-body regressions and psychic phenomenon being conducted simultaneously in Russia and the USA on animals and people. There is also an interest in precognition and thought transference. He told me that some programs were highly classified by the government. We discovered that we both believed it was possible to travel out of body, and he actually proved it in describing a room in my California home without ever having seen it. We both had a high regard for the possibility of communicating with the dead. We declared that, and I believe, that people do not truly die, but they are really alive in another dimension. Henry asked me if we would make a pact that if one of us died and it was possible, we would make every attempt to communicate. Never did I think that this would actually come to pass, but years later it did. Months later, the other guy, John, asked me to marry him, and I said yes. We decided that before doing so, we would live together for 1 year. I chose to live in California rather than New York so that John would not have to transfer to New Jersey. I hated the New York climate. My older boys were in Florida and not speaking to me, so distance was no problem. My youngest son, Jim, would live in California with us as soon as he graduated. That would be in about 3 months. My departure from New York was traumatic for me. It was painful leaving my family and friends behind, especially my sister. But I felt that I truly wanted the most stable life and place for my young son, Jim, to come to. Henry was very upset, and he said, "Well, I guess I was too slow. I wanted you to be my mistress and come to Washington, D.C., and Jim would go to a fine academy." He said he had discussed my working for Elizabeth Mondale as her assistant, as she was then committee head for the Federal Arts Commission. I was truly floored, but try as I couldn't imagine myself living in D.C. and being Henry's mistress. The only honorable outlook for me from my loneliness, and I had a sense of needing to be a part of a family. Henry was a very sweet man, very interesting and intelligent, and I truly enjoyed his company. He was also a good sport. He apologized to me and said he had not moved fast enough, and he wished me well. He reminded me of my pact, of our pact, and asked me to please allow him to keep in touch. "I will not call when your husband is home so that I do not interfere with your relationship," he said. A year later, when I opened the gallery, we found it easier to keep in touch. Henry called me regularly, about 2 or 3 times per month, and sent me the galleys of the book he was writing. In his memoirs of his days with John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson in the White House. I never kept secrets from John, so I told him about the calls, and I explained that Henry was both my friend and a gentleman and not a threat to us, and he accepted that. When I discovered an artist I really like, I called and met Henry in New York, and we showed the photos and slides to David Guggenheim at the Guggenheim Museum. That artist is now represented in the Chicago Museum. 6 years later, Henry died. While I was on a trip to New York for my brother-in-law's funeral, I had this amazing experience of seeing a small figure sitting on the wing of the plane. A man's voice said, "It's over. It's all over." I turned to see who the gentleman might be behind me. No one was there. I thought, well, maybe I was daydreaming. When I returned to my home in California, there was a letter with his death notices from the local papers sent to me by his daughter. 6 months later, on a vacation in Mexico City with old friends, I was invited to sleep in the bedroom that my friend Graciela liked to meditate in. It was a lovely room, and it was in the midst of a sad divorce from John. I knew these friends and also knew that they were prominent also in politics. The house was a mansion on the streets of diplomats in Mexico City. I slept well that first night, but had a strange experience. Someone had been standing by my bed in the middle of the night. He said, "Didn't I tell you that if you needed me, I would always be there for you?" I said, "Henry, what are you doing in George's body?" He disappeared. In the morning, I went down to breakfast, and my friend said, "Well, did you sleep well?" I said, "I did." I said, "But I had this strange thing happen." I told her what had happened. My friend sat down quickly on the chair. I could see shock on her face. Her husband said, "Say that name again." So I did. He said, "Guess who was the last person who slept in that bed? How did you know him?" So I told them the story. "My goodness," he said, "I was the one who introduced Henry to Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter is an old friend of ours." Coincidence? I guess not. Twilight Zone? Maybe. What I've learned from this is that with only 10% of our brain in use, we believe we know all the vast kingdom of God, and we are clearly offensive to suggest that we know it all. I hope you enjoyed this ghostly tale from Sarah Sullivan. If you did, please give us a like or consider subscribing to the channel. And we'll see you back here next time at Meg's Magical Mansion.